Hi students, I'm Juan. In this chapter, we will understand how to compose a background and understand the basic rules to create a composition. This video is more theoretical. I will show you a few examples based on photos. There are three fundamental principles you need to understand before starting to draw your own backgrounds. The first one is image depth. Here we can see one of the pictures I took while hiking. In most images, there are a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. These are used to give depth to the composition. So I will divide them to show these three elements to you clearly. A lot of aspiring artists don't take the time to compose an image, and the result is often a flat background. To avoid this, take your time to define the space where the character will be. Give it depth through the division of elements in the foreground, middle ground, and background. Okay, but how do we tell the foreground apart from the background? It's quite easy. First of all, the foreground is the most saturated part. This means the colors are flashy and vibrant. The foreground is also the place where you can find the most contrast. This means the colors will be darker and brighter than the middle ground and of course the background. Sometimes, like in this image, the foreground is darker, but not always. Now let's go to the next level of deepness. The middle ground. The middle ground, like the name says, will always be between the foreground and the background. It won't have the strong colors of the foreground, but at the same time, its colors won't be as dull as the background. It's like an in-between. When people draw concept art for video games and they want to showcase a building, an emplacement, or a city, they put this on the middle ground since the characters will be smaller in the foreground. These artists put many assets, like lamps, barrels, or a house in the foreground to reinforce the impression of depth and make the elements on the middle ground look way bigger. Of course, the middle ground will be less saturated, less contrasted, and less darker than the foreground. This is why I drew the red line, less flashy here. Our third layer will be, of course, the background. In this picture, you can see the atmospheric depth. Have you ever wondered why in Earth, when we see far away, the colors are way duller? If we were on the moon, the colors will have the same saturation at the foreground and at the background, because there is no atmospheric depth. The atmosphere of the Earth shades the background with its color, which in this case is blue. The colors here will be less saturated and less contrasted. There are three tools you have to remember: saturation, contrast, and depth. These are the key to making successful backgrounds. Let me show you other examples. I will divide the background in three layers of depth quickly. I took this picture in Peru, a beautiful country. In this photo, I put the llama gang on the foreground. I can tell apart the foreground from the middle ground because of the contrast. If you check the rock shadows really well, they are darker around the llamas. Just the middle ground white rocks on the left have almost the same color, but they have less contrast. One way to check your colors and contrast is by closing your eyes a bit. Everything will be blurry. If you use glasses and use them, well, this is the time to take them off. Right now, the image should be way more contrasted and you can focus on the whole picture. When using this technique, we can tell apart easily the middle ground red mountains from the background more bluish mountains. Another technique is to zoom out. It's the same as closing your eyes a bit or taking off the glasses. When the image has less details, you can clearly see the composition, contrast, and colors. Now, let's check another example. This one is a tricky one. It's again from Peru. The foreground is really hard to miss. We can see all the vibrant colors of the clothes. Because of these colors, this part is clearly the protagonist of the photo. You can use saturation to reinforce certain parts of your composition. If we look from far away, the middle ground is clearly the mountains. The background will be then, I think, the sky. Okay, so these are the first principles. Giving depth to your image through atmospheric depth, saturation, and contrast. Remember that. The second fundamental principle to create a compelling background is understanding perspective. We will break down this one-point perspective in this image. As you can see, the lines here converge into the same point, called the vanishing point. When you use perspective correctly, you can bring a whole new level of depth to your artwork. Sometimes, handling perspective can be tiring. This is why I use the Perspective Tools 2 extension. Before buying it, be sure to completely understand perspective. This extension works mostly with vectors. So, this is the reason why we use the pen tool. So I click on the pen tool. I will review the extension panel later on. First, I make 2 points just by clicking on them. This will make a straight line which has to cross the vanishing point where all the building lines converge. And then I click on Horizon in the Perspective Tools 2 panel. This takes time to charge, but it will create an horizon line. The horizon line is where the vanishing points are placed. The closer the buildings will be to the horizon, the smaller they will be. I will make a new layer to show you how the buildings are deformed by perspective. Here I'm drawing the horizontal lines of the buildings, which are cubical. Like I said before, these lines converge into the vanishing point, giving the impression of depth. It's just an impression. The horizon line will always be at eye level. Okay, there is just one simple rule to remember. All the lines who are above the horizon line run down into the vanishing point. On the contrary, the objects who are below the horizon line run up into the vanishing point. It's really easy. Now I create another layer to show you the perspective grid you should have when making perspective. I use again the pen tool and create a line. It's even better if you create too far away to make the perspective look better. Once I click on Grid, the Perspective Tools extension processes the information of the line I drew before, and it makes a perspective grid. The perspective grid goes into the vanishing point here. Well, it may not be perfect because I should have made another with the pen tool before clicking on Grid in the Perspective Tools extension panel. But it will be okay. It's always good to change the colors of the grid, to tell them apart. By using the paint point, we can change the color of the grid easily. To make the perspective grid more visible, I just turned down the opacity of the image. As you can see here, the cars are all ranged up on the same line, and they become smaller the further they are from us. This means the closer they are to the vanishing point, the smaller they become. It is the same for the buildings. The windows are clearly bigger at the edge of our frame because they are closer from us. The principle is easy. Near big, far away small. If you don't have the Perspective Tools 2 extension, don't worry. There is another way to create perspective grids. We use the Polygon tool in the Shape Tools menu. Then we go to the top of the workspace and we click on the small wheel icon to change the settings of this tool. We remove smooth corners and we click on the square icon next to star. Then we increase the number of indent size by 99%. Now we create another layer and we drag it from the vanishing point towards the edge of the frame. This is how I learned perspective before buying Perspective Tools 2. To show you how do you use normally the perspective grid, I will just draw a cube, a simple cube. The first side is quite easy, just a square. Then we create a new edge by drawing from the vertex towards the vanishing point, using the perspective grid. You see, the cube is now in perspective. Just follow the grid and it should be okay. I really want to show you something else. There is a good method to draw objects through perspective with realistic distance between them. Let's say we will draw trees here. We draw a vertical line. Then we draw another line where our second tree should be. Okay, now we draw a line that goes from the top of the first vertical line through the middle of the second one. When this line meets the base point grid of the other two lines, then we draw a third one. When this line meets the base point grid of the other two lines, Then we draw a third one. And that's it. The method can repeat itself forever. It gives a feeling of depth and realism between the distance of those objects. We can even do it the other way around to draw a tree closer to the foreground. Quite easy, huh? The first thing that comes to mind when looking at this image is that there are at least 3 different vanishing points. One on top and 2 at the sides. Let me show you where. I put a white layer on top and reduce the opacity. The red lines go to the same vanishing point. They continue all through the image. There is another shocking thing. We cannot see the horizon line in this picture. This is because we have a bottom angle view. We are looking above the horizon line, and this is why it doesn't appear in the frame. The blue lines, who are on the other face of the building, go into a second vanishing point. However, both points are placed on the horizon line. There is even a third vanishing point if we count the rectangle on the edge of the building. But we won't do that, for now at least. We don't count it. On the contrary, let's focus on another vanishing point, the one from above. This third vanishing point is not on the horizon line, it's way above in the sky. We can see that all the green lines will converge into a point up above. Having 3 vanishing points is not always necessary, but most of the time it enhances the representation of our 3D world. All these grids go to 3 vanishing points. Only with 3 vanishing points you can recreate a complex image like this one. With all this info we can make 3D objects all across the space. Also, the drawings don't need to be precise each time. You just have to give the impression the object is following the grids. Sometimes some objects don't follow the main grids of the image. In this case you can draw a cube or a cylinder and then draw a plane within it to specify the angle of the object. Then you can draw it and it will blend with all the image. Of course, there are other tips and tools in perspective, but we don't have enough time and we could do a whole course about it. With this basic knowledge, you should be able to draw mostly any composition. Look at the llamas, they're having fun at Machu Picchu. They look so happy. Okay, let's focus on the last principle, composition. How do we compose an image? There is one tip who can help us understand composition better, and if we use it correctly, it can become one of the best tools. First, we saw how depth affects an image by dividing the background, foreground and middle ground. In this picture, the llamas on the grass are on the foreground. The horizon line is above the image. To compose an image, you should start using the rule of thirds. You divide the length on the height of the width of the image by 3, drawing straight lines each time. Always on a different layer, of course, we're not savages. The intersection between the horizontal and vertical lines are the power points. The lines under power points are places will attract the eye more easily. If you want to place an important element, like the llamas here, you should put them on a PowerPoint or at least along a line. The background goes clearly on the upper part of the 3/3. The foreground takes the lower third of the photo, and the middle ground goes nearly, well, in the middle. Please don't put a lot of elements on all the lines or all the PowerPoints. Just focus on 1 or 2 lines or 1 PowerPoint. Well, here I wrote focal point, but I don't think it's. This is why I put the llamas on the left. Because of its placement, our eyes are focused more in the brown llama rather than the white one. Placing the llamas on this PowerPoint makes the llamas the subject of the picture. You should use the rule of thirds to guide the eye of the viewer. In Western societies, we read from left to right. This means we will start looking at the top left and finish, of course, at the lower right. The color of the llamas contrasts also with the green environment. This means we can use color to reveal the subject. It can be really useful. Now, Let's see the same rule on another image. Here we have the little llamas again. The llamas are both on the right vertical line of the rule of thirds. They are, of course, again the subject. The foreground is placed around like the lower third of the picture, alongside, of course, of the right vertical line of the beautiful llamas. The background takes the rest of the space. But there is a problem. I think the llamas are not placed correctly. The llama's eye here, this llama's eye, reading his paw, could be at the same place than the PowerPoint just above. The composition of this image can be arranged by cropping the frame. We click on the crop tool and we go to the rule of thirds above. Here we can see all the composition options Photoshop offers. The first one, of course, is the rule of thirds. Then we have a bunch of others. We can also change the aspect of the frame by clicking on original ratio. I don't think if you say it ratio or ratio. Okay. Anyway, here we have many presets. We can pick, I don't know, maybe the 16:9, which is a common film frame ratio. The rule of thirds appears with the new frame, of course. We can drag it and try different compositions. The problem is that we lose nearly all of the foreground, and we do not want that. Well, I think I can choose also to cut all the foreground. This way, the foreground will be our subject. This means the llamas, which can totally be done. We put the PowerPoint on the llama's side and click on Enter. Now, because of our new frame, the brown llama has lost a lot of importance. He's so sad. He's now only a mount for his rider. We can tell by the sad look on his eyes. Well, the rule of thirds is applied perfectly in this case if we are okay with the fact that brown llama will be just the sidekick. I feel terrible for the poor thing, so we will go back to the previous frame with Ctrl Z. Even if his eye is not where it should be, I think it works better this way. Well, now we have a new picture, but it has many composition problems. So if we draw the rule of thirds, we come to the conclusion that our llama is not on the lines, nor he is on the PowerPoints. He is too much to the right. We need to correct this mess right now. We choose the crop tool with C. Choose our aspect ratio also, and check if the PowerPoints are in the right place. Currently, of course, they aren't. We will then crop the image and zoom on the llama to put one of the PowerPoints in his eye. The eyes are very compelling, so it's good to have them as PowerPoints. But it's okay if they aren't in any also. Here the llama is placed along the right vertical line. His body and hands are mostly in the center of the lower third, which can be interesting. We click on Enter and we admire the new frame. It certainly works a lot better. There is clearly a foreground and a background, and the subject is the main attraction. I will try doing another composition with another type of frame. Here we have the diagonal composition. The PowerPoints, of course, are not the same than the rule of thirds. This type of composition can work wonders on one-point perspectives. The triangle is one of my favorites. It can be used on action scenes. I totally love it. It gives more importance to empty space on the composition. We can also flip the image horizontally to have other composition options. It's harder to do this while making a film, but when making an animated illustration is way easier. The golden ratio is another way of doing composition. It's like a rule of thirds, but zoom in. Personally, I never use it. We can put the PowerPoint on his little hands if we want. Okay, the golden spiral is well known among the artists. Here we are going to focus on his tiny head, so we zoom a lot and crop nearly all the picture. It is used with the 16:9 ratio aspects, but I don't know. However, I think golden spiral shines the most when you use a square frame. Here we are going to put the PowerPoint on its nose. We click on Enter. It's a great profile pic, don't you think? Well, it seems he doesn't like close-up photos. Composition is all about making choices, placing the subject in the right place and letting empty spaces on the image. If you charge the image with tons of details everywhere, the eye will drown and it won't be able to focus on the subject, which is what really matters. I forgot to tell you one of the most important rules, of course. You should always have fun while composing an image. It should be your fuel. This way you will enjoy making your backgrounds. Okay, now that we're done, let's make a quick recap. Today we'll learn the 3 principles for creating a great background. First, give depth to your image by figuring out where you will place the foreground, the middle ground, and, of course, the background. Use saturation and contrast to tell them apart. The foreground has more saturation and more contrast, of course, and the colors are also warmer. On the contrary, the background has less saturation, less contrast, and has cool colors due to atmospheric perspective. Secondly, you should check if your images go accordingly to the perspective rules. This means the objects or masses in the image have to converge into one or more vanishing points, which will be placed on the horizon line. If you are above the horizon line, then the lines run down towards the vanishing point. If you are below the lines, they go up towards it. Thirdly, check if your image is well composed. When drawing an image, you should always start by placing the subject on it. Remember that empty space is your ally and you shouldn't fill the image with details all over the place. These principles work together hand by hand. They often complement each other. Also, if you want to check the contrast and composition of your image, you should put a black and white filter and activate it once in a while. Don't be afraid to experiment when creating backgrounds. In this image, there are 2 llamas. Remember to make a path for the eye so it can travel around the picture. This can be made with a combination of using all the principles we reviewed. You can also try blurring parts of the image to accentuate the subject or reinforce the overall depth. Don't be afraid to overlap the foreground into the middle ground or the background. Lastly, use the rules to have fun. Create funny compositions. Try finding images on internet or taking pictures that are compelling to you. In next class, I will show you my process to create an image and some key concepts about animation. Okay, now we're done, so have a great day!